Look, many of us are here today because the key reason they're here is because a lot of us are interested in we're all about wanting better urban outcomes. And a lot of us here today are also educators, we're lecturers, we're academics, and we're really wanting to be at the cutting edge of teaching, and importantly, teaching a grounded inquiry into urbanism. And so I suppose our traditional domain of teaching, and the city, I suppose, as a laboratory, is Sydney. And what we see behind here is pretty well what we practice and preach to our students. And as we'll see as we go through this urbanism that we teach, I think, is primarily orientated to what I call the formal production of the city and its urban order. And so we get involved in all sorts of activities with our students. And some of our speakers here today, such as Rod, are involved in the Greater Sydney Commission and Metropolitan Planning. But architects and planners, we get involved in densification, intensification, and we're involved in centres policies and all sorts of things. But the question I put to you, and it's a cutting theme through my talk today and sharing with you, is that when we're trying to educate our diverse cohort of planners, designers and architects, is Sydney urbanism really representative of the real cities of Asia Pacific where we live, and especially in terms of the speed and growth of urbanisation and inequality. So is Sydney and its urbanism and what we teach really what we should be teaching? And so what I'll really take you through today, share with you, is really a different kind of urbanism. And the sorts of things that I want to share with you is what I call the other urbanity. Those other forms of architecture, design and planning that shape the order of the city as expressed in slums and informal settlements and informality. So I was just thinking about this thing about bottom up. It's the self-constructed city, and you see in some of these images. It's that self-constructed image that for a lot of people in this class, and I know for a lot of students, they really tremble with. They have a problem coping with. And I know when we take students overseas, and the looks on their faces at the beginning of studios, that they're absolutely in fear, which is the reverse of what they are in about 10 days afterwards. When these two really good texts came out in 2006, one of them, Planet of Slums, I got from the library, the other one I bought, The Shadow of Cities, they really drilled into two key issues. Both of them talked about the creativity and the ingenuity of what you find in slums and informal settlements, this incredible bottom-up, really energetic form of urbanism. But on the other hand, they also pointed to the future about the rise in slums and the rise in the number of slums. And I suppose some of us at that time, me perhaps being a bit naive in 2005 or so, I was hoping that things such as the Millennium Development Goals, for example, the MDGs, which are now replaced by the SDGs, would make some impact into reducing those numbers who live their lives in the communities in those sort of physical forms. But you can see here from 1990 to 2014 that there's been something like a 28% increase in slums and informal settlements. And this figure that I'm giving you here is actually conservative, so I'm saying 25%, so a quarter of our urban populations, in fact it's most probably 33% of our urban population. These communities live their lives in sort of housing and with low services and the rest of it in slums and informal settlements. And the bulk of this is in Asia and Africa. So as we've heard today, 50% passed the limit in around about 2008. We're now in about 54%. And that figure of the 25 to 30, that's expected to be around 40% by 2025. It's a massive challenge. And most importantly, on our doorstep in Asia and the Pacific, in fact in the Pacific there's over 1 million people living their lives in slums and informal settlements. Asia and the Pacific, it's the home to the world's largest urban slum populations and the largest concentrations of people living below in the poverty line. So this was work I was involved in with the UN in 2015. And one of the nice things about this, we try to sort of paint a bit of a reality check about where things are at and sort of some of the features that we see in slums and informal settlements, the low quality housing, low or no services, the overcrowding, the health impacts that we've heard about today, tenure issues, and some of the most vulnerable communities. So they're complex. Let's not pretend they're not complex. They are, and in fact that's the challenge. But importantly, they've got strong ties to the formal city, and increasingly what we're seeing is that many of these communities are the subject of prey, being preyed upon by governments and the private sector. What you see across Asia and the Pacific is lots of governments going through this process of trying to work out how to address sort of slums and informal settlements. They all do it in different ways. This example from Indonesia here, they've obviously done a lot of mapping. They've sort of rated their settlements and they've given them some priority. And so those obviously with the red, they're pretty well in the firing line to some form of upgrading, which in itself is an issue and we'll touch on in a sec. And it's not just governments themselves. Obviously governments sometimes hand it over to the private sector, or sometimes they'll do it together. And hence there's most probably a business driver behind a lot of these upgrading proposals that are happening across Asia and Pacific. And so you see some really interesting expressions coming out in these upgradings. A lot of these settlements are actually in a city, so they're ripe for redevelopment and they're ripe for the private sector to hop in there and take action. So in fact these images you see here, those top two where you see the word liar, that actually says in Indonesian that we are not squatters. So they're actually the community mobilising themselves. So these people are actually saying that we do have tenure, we do have something in writing to say that we are legal. So they're trying to make their voice that they do have some legitimacy in the city. The other thing it also shows you increasingly that residents and groups are mobilising to try and take on governments. Even though we know at the end of the day, when governments want to come with their full force of power, then they'll come with their full force of power. And so they live in very insecure circumstances. So there's a really understanding slums and informal settlement, especially through, I suppose, a design and planning architecture background. You're looking at what makes up this sort of, looking at physical form, relations to social. It's this thing about the bottom-up, self-constructed city. So this is the one I'll just briefly show you a little about Lebak. And so it's incredibly irregular. And we've talked about today, and we'll come up again about things about being non-smooth and irregular. But in many ways, their morphology units, the bits and pieces, the blocks and so forth that make them up, are fairly similar to here, but they're just composed in a totally different sort of irregular and perhaps a non-linear form. So we tend to get all these same things, the blocks and alleyways and so forth, but they're a lot more negotiated and a lot more malleable. And so this is a kampung, or an informal settlement. It's definitely not a slum. There's slums adjoining it. And this actually has evolved, believe it or not, has evolved out of being in rice paddies. And in fact, it's actually a network of alleyways, which I'll show in a second, are actually built on the walls of the rice paddies. So that there's a progression. It's not chaos. And it's a very fine-grained morphology, incredibly mixed use, multifunctional, all sorts of childcare, preschool, clothes washing, traders, everything working in this amazing, friendly settlement. And what you find is that you can actually work out the order in this thing. Sure, it's a little bit complex, a bit messy, it just takes you a little bit longer, but there is order and there definitely is rules. And so you can see here that some of those alleyways, as I said, align with walls of rice paddies. And sure, they weave and twist, but there's an order and a logic to that. And in fact, aligning with that is in terms of the housing. Again, initially, we go in, look at these places, yeah, you can't work anything through it, but after a week or 2 weeks, you find that, look, there's a simple 6 or 7 or 8 steps in how this housing happens, both vertically and both horizontally. And we can see here that there's a number of ways in which these housing starts off, perhaps detached, set back, and then sort of slowly builds out and attaches and goes out and moves up and so forth, and which I'll touch on in a little while. So, just quickly, we're going to move along, it's only 15 minutes. I really want to ask the question is, how come in the built environment disciplines, why do we struggle with understanding and responding to this street-based urbanism? Why do we have such a problem? Yeah? Why don't we engage with it? It's on our doorstep. 30% of the world's population, but why don't we engage with it? I'll quickly move through this because some of these have been raised today, and there's some really interesting comments. And clearly, a lot of it comes out of the modern sort of planning and architectural era, the Industrial Revolution, and the advent of the one-size-fits-all, and the need to regulise. And as you'll see, I'll come to the word, and the need to formalise. And I think it's really important that we recognise and we step back and we think that our connection with cities, when we think about it, is the visual. It is the visual connection. That's our first connection. And we connect with order and geometry and forms and aesthetics and taste. And through that, we tend to make a fairly quick leap to about the need to reimpose a new order. And those things have been ingrained to us through our study and so forth, through things like the application of City Beautiful, Garden City, Suburb, and the modern movement. And as we heard from Rod, and we've heard from a few others here today, we've seen this thing. There's some of the utopian. This will be the first accepted modern master plan by Howard. And as Rod made the good point, was Howard himself acknowledges that it was never intended. He says this was just diagrammatic. But as we can see, what's happened is that these things get ingrained and people pick them up and they implant them from then evermore. I suppose the point I want to make is that you see right at the top there, he talks about slumless. Again, this reference to the need to get rid of slums. And of course, we may as well have another go at Corbusier. We've all had a go at Corbusier today. Let's might as well just hop on the boat and have another go. But he was another classic who really got stuck into things like slums and so forth, and the functional city, segregation and so forth. And those fantastic quotes of his: a house is a machine for living in, a curved street is a donkey track, a straight street, a road for men, and architecture must be machine-like. And for those of you who haven't had a look at the Corbusier, the Athens Charter, they're the sorts of things that shaped our planning and design in the last century, and they ingrained those ideas of functionalism and land use segregation and getting rid of slums. I'll quickly move on. Some great work done by Alexander, again been mentioned today, so he's obviously well acknowledged, and where he obviously has a go at the way we apply the linear street structure to our planning and design of the cities. And I suppose when I look at Alexander's work, the way I interpret it is that he's really challenging us to respond to city complexity and its assemblage. And I think this quote from Alexander, and this is from his really deep intellectual work in 2000 called The Nature of Order, and he says it's the notions of disorder evolved from a lack of understanding the evolutionary and organising explicit paths of change that shape one configuration to the other. And I think that's one of the issues that people can't get their head around when dealing with slums and informal settlements. And so look, it's not surprising that we've got these flawed assumptions, these stereotypes that keep going on and on. That it's a form of urbanism which is a blight on the city. Well, clearly not. One size fits all? Definitely not. Upgrading, as we'll see, equates to eviction, demolition, resettlement? No. We're all equal in the participation process? We definitely know that's not the case. Full of social misfits? No. And most importantly, and it's been touched on today, that architecture and planning alone can make major changes to social structure, and that they're all illegal. Definitely not. And hence we've got a really poor understanding, I suppose, of the sort of what I would call the formal and the informal city nexus, and its a key role in shaping our understanding and the way the city rolls out. These places are incredibly important for affordable housing, jobs, transportation, trading and informal economy. I was in Canberra yesterday with DFAT on behalf of the uni, advising on their urban programs, and they said to me that 70% of the employment in Asia is in the informal economy, which is a really amazing point to make in terms of understanding the city. And so look, the bottom line is that it's little understood, I argue, and engaged with. And hence, this is what we see, and this is what we tend to teach. This hierarchical control, geometric conformity, aesthetic beauty, repetition of consistent physical elements and accepted patterns. And for those who perhaps don't fit the accepted mainstream order, then obviously you're on the outer. And I would argue strongly and I think it's been said today, it might have been said in the earlier thing, that there's a confusion between physical order and better social outcomes. Or I'd argue the other way around, that social order is seen as being solved by new physical regimes. Yeah. It's clearly out of balance. And unfortunately, I think that's what we teach a lot of our students, unfortunately. Understanding informal settlements and slums, you really need to understand things about fractal geometry, this irregular, non-smooth form shape. And for those of us, when I go to Asia, and the first thing I do is I get in a taxi and I'll ask them to take me to an informal settlement, and I'll spend a bit of time, because what I'm really fascinated in is the ordering principles, how this all happens, and how you get these sorts of lines and shapes going together. And for me, this is rich. I don't see this as chaotic and to be thrown out, which is what a lot of architects tells me should happen. So I think one way to look at it is that these things they're not sort of working side by side. They're actually hybrid, they're complementary, and they're most probably co-evolution, I think, is the way that these things are happening. And I think the other narrative there about sort of dysfunctional, chaotic, clearly they're very simplistic. So just very quickly, we're just about nearly out of time, so I haven't got too many to go. It's a bottom-up. It's a really rich form of urbanism. In fact, if we had another conversation, I'd nearly argue that the rights to the city are, in fact, for a lot of these communities, they've got the rights to the city. But in fact, the reality is it's very temporary, and they're always living under the fear of eviction. So there's lots of fantastic things happening. These things that we teach our students here about setback and so forth, in informal settlements, it's not just setback, it's things to do with aligned. It's what we call set forward, it's what we call set above, it's what we call set over. There's this really interesting concepts about assemblage, which has sort of been touched on today, and I wouldn't call it public interest, I'd nearly call it communal interest. And one of the things I note in Asia when I go into the settlements is that there is a humanitarian respect in these communities. And one thing you'll note on this thing here is you'll note that the community themselves have painted those lines on the edge of that alleyway to let the community know and let the people know that front that we don't want you to push in anymore, because you will affect the way that we trade and we move our trolleys and the way that we walk through these areas. And hence, yeah, I think the way to look at these is that these things are in place. They're not out of place, they're ordered, they're not disordered. So it's a less obvious order, eclectic mix of designs, materiality. So let's get on to the last few slides. The old famous so what? That old famous so what question that we use in our classes. Where to from here? And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give you a few practical examples as an educator and an academic, and one committed to this area that I think that we need to go. And I think globally we can imagine. That's the most important thing. We can imagine globally better futures. We have the new urban agenda with some really strong statements about leaving no one behind and cities for all. We've also heard today about the SDGs. They replace the Millennium Development Goals, and SDG number 11 is the urban goal. And it makes a really strong statement about cities and human settlements being inclusive, safe and resilient. But more exciting for me, as someone trying to get the word around about how we get better cities and slums and informal settlements, is the first target of SDG 11 talks about better housing, services, and most importantly, it mentions about the reduction and the upgrading of slums. And this is really a challenging work. So moving from global to local across different human rights contexts, development contexts, different countries going at different speeds, trying to sort of grapple with urbanisation, it's complex and it's messy. And I'd argue that the SDGs, especially SDG 11, is meaningless, absolutely meaningless, unless we nuance it and we colour it by what's actually happening bottom up and on the ground. Otherwise, they mean nothing. They mean nothing. They're just global. They're just global words agreed to by 80 plus countries. I did this interesting piece of research last year and it attracted a lot of international attention, and mainly because I suppose I was having a bit of a dig, we cut to it, about the way that master plans and policies, they all talk about the need to formalise. It's formalising the informal. There's only one way forward. You need to formalise and you must align with our regulations, our policies and so forth. And so I did looked at some examples from Indonesia about how we try to kill diversity by formalising it. So, and obviously here there's an important need to build leadership and especially, for example, local government leadership, as well as our future architects and planners. And so I'll just quickly go through these. These are a couple of, so again, you can see some of the, what's happening at ground level here, and you can see some of the solutions above. And you ask the question, is that urban success, sort of needing to be formalised? And whose resilience is being built? And the same here, is this inclusive urbanism or is this just market urbanism? Let's be honest, whose resilience is being built? Human scale, ground level urbanism to what? Second option, so just on the last couple of slides, is that we can, what I would call the conservative option. And that's pretty well what we're doing at the moment. And so we're doing some good things within our resources. We take students into Asia, cross-cultural teaching studios, and luckily we've got a really great symposium coming up in September. But the question is this really constructive, longer-term change? And so, look, I'll finish off with a suggestion, and I'm being here about practical things, that we can be innovative at the Asia-Pacific level, and we can show leadership and vision. And what I would suggest is that we move towards something to do with inclusive cities in Asia-Pacific, and we get a bigger view of urbanism. So why not an Asia-Pacific Centre of Excellence in planning the design of inclusive cities? Why not promote the linkages between the formal and the informal urbanism? Incremental, adaptive, leadership and design. What does upgrading mean? Because when you speak to all these leaders, these councillors, they all tell you that upgrading is about demolition, To start with, actually, the existing urbanism and in situ, they still don't tend to get on the agenda. And we should be looking at the future and current leaders of tomorrow. So really, the choice for making and shaping of inclusive cities is really with us. So I'm going to finish off with the last slide, and this was a slide that I had a good chat with Martin about the last week, because in some ways it resonates about the theme of this whole talk. And I like this slide for two reasons. It's one that I keep showing my students nearly every week because I'm so into the slide, but I like it for two reasons. Firstly, the same 1890s in London, the physical determinism, it's a physical solution to solve the problems of London at that time. Yep. That's the way, and that was the way things were all rolling out during that beginning of that modern era. But the thing that really resonates with me is those words, understanding the city as it is, and understanding the city as it might be. Because I argue to, and I think you've got my drift today, that we tend to preoccupy ourselves with the city as it might be and as it should be, but do we really understand the city as it is? Do we really understand the real Asia-Pacific city as it is? Thank you.